Hello and welcome to the briefing series Marketing for Charities, brought to you by the Worshipful Company of Marketers. This is the third of the briefings and will cover the area of research. My name is Peter Rees and it's my pleasure once again to be your host and narrator for today's session. As before, I shall start today with an overview of the agenda and the points we're going to cover. Most of this briefing is about market research, which is part of the step of the SOSTAC model to do with situation analysis. So the first part of this briefing will be about different tools and techniques available to help you execute efficient market research. Now, market research is quite a tricky and specialist area, and in the second part of this briefing I'll give you some quick win approaches so that even fairly new people to this area should be able to get some usable and worthwhile results. I'm then going to cover an area which we've discussed a few times before, and that is the area of stakeholders. I will explain who they are in the context of a charity and look at the reasons why we should be interested in their opinions and how to prioritise the ones with whom we should engage. I'll then go through some next steps, answer any questions that you have, and conclude with some final remarks. So as I just mentioned, we're going to go through this briefing today in the context of the SOSTAC model, which I explained to you the last time round. And today we're going to focus on the situation step of the SOSTAC model, which, if you remember, answers the question, where are we today? I've split this step into two briefings. The first one today, as I've explained, is about market research, and it'll be followed by the next briefing, which will talk about some specific marketing models and frameworks we can use to get deeper insights into the marketplaces in which our charity operates. Let me start by going into some tools and techniques available to undertake and execute market research. The first thing I'd like to do is talk about the different ways that research can be categorised. And the first one is perhaps one that many people are not familiar with, and that's the difference between deductive and inductive research. Deductive research is the one perhaps most people are familiar with if you've ever done a survey or a questionnaire, and that is the researcher is trying to get an answer to a question. So for example, I might want to do some research to answer the question, what is the most popular social media channel for donors to my charity? The second type is inductive research, and as it explains here, in this case you collect data and observations about a particular situation, and from those findings you try and draw up a rule or an explanation to explain what's going on. Market research, like most disciplines, has its own particular jargon and language, and the next two terms I just want to draw to your attention is the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. And as the name suggests, quantitative research is all about collecting numbers, statistics, facts and figures from which we can draw conclusions or have questions answered. Qualitative research is more subjective. It's about attitudes, feelings, opinions and emotions. So these are just another way of categorising the sorts of information you might be collecting with your research activities. The final two categories of market research are shown here, and those are the differences between primary and secondary research. Primary research is research that's specifically commissioned by your organisation, by your charity, to answer a specific question or to come up with a particular rule or explanation to what's happening. Secondary market research, on the other hand, relies on publicly available and commonly accessed information that was not primarily commissioned by your own charity, but it's information that your own charity can use for its own benefit. So it could be reports from other charities in the sector, it could be white papers, industry analyses, conference speeches, government or local government reports, financial results, or the information from the other charities' websites or from the charity commission. So primary research is research you've commissioned for your own purposes. Secondary research is publicly available information that you can use for your own benefit, though you didn't commission it and typically you didn't pay for it. The next area I want to cover with you is the research tools available. What different techniques can you use to gather the information that I've just been describing? And here's a list of the most popular and most commonly found methods to get that information. Now I'll have to say now there is some overlap between them, as you'll see as we go through the different approaches. Sampling is just a generic term to talk about taking a representative sample of your target audience and asking them on the basis that what they say is generally applicable to the wider population. So for example, if you had, let's say, 500 donors to your organisation, it's fairly clear that if you just ask one of them their opinion about things, it's not representative. But if you had a large enough sample, a representative sample, then asking, for example, 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 is enough people in the sample to be representative of the total population, the total number of people, in this case 500, who you're trying to get information from. Now, it's quite important that you use some particular methods to choose the sample and don't let people select or volunteer themselves. So sometimes people issue surveys or questionnaires on, for example, social media groups. They might post a link to a questionnaire on Facebook, and then they're quite happy because a certain number of people answer it. Well, the point is the people who answered it may not be representative of the categories of people whose opinion you're really interested in. The second one is questionnaires, and we've seen quite often in our lives either a questionnaire arrives through the post, or somebody stops you outside a shop or outside an office and asks you if you'd spend a few minutes just going through and answering some questions for them. And that's a questionnaire. It's usually a one-to-one administered survey where one person stands and asks somebody what their opinion are and how they would answer various questions. Now, nowadays this can be delivered either face-to-face or online through a tool or technique that I'll explain in a few slides' time. The next method or approach is interviews, which I guess you're familiar with, and this is where you sit down with the researcher and they ask you, either in a structured or unstructured way, your opinion or your answers to a number of questions. So in a fairly unstructured interview, you can just essentially have a chat with minimal guidance from the interviewer. But if you want a guided interview, then the interviewer has to keep the subject on track and sort of steer the conversation to cover the 2 or 3 or 4 interview areas to get the answers to the categories of questions that are required. The next area is called a focus group, and if you're not familiar with these, this is like a group interview. So rather than the interviewer just speaking to one person, they will have perhaps 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 people in the room and get a discussion going amongst the group. Again, there's quite a skill involved in making sure that the whole conversation isn't dominated by 1 or 2 sort of very verbose and expressive individuals, that everybody gets the chance to express their opinion. So managing a focus group, again, is quite a skilled art and is often delegated to specialist companies who have expertise in this area. The next area is observation. That's just simply looking at what's going on. So if you had wanted to do some observation about something in the retail sector, something in the fashion industry or the food industry, you would literally go to a supermarket or to a fashion outlet or to a shopping mall and observe the sorts of people that are going into the shop, how long they're staying, what do they look at when they're in there. So you can get a lot of information just by observing, literally observing what's going on in a particular market situation. The next is what's called case studies. In this situation, you would actually go and compile information about the particular area of business or particular area of the market that you were interested in. So, for example, you might do a case study about other charities in your sector, other health charities or animal support charities or homeless charities. You'd actually look at their websites, look at their press releases, look at their social media activity, look at any blogs or public utterances, press releases, and draw up a summary of their activities so you can compare one to the other. The final research tool here is surveys, which are quite similar to questionnaires, but questionnaires tend to ask specific yes/no questions or choose from a list, whereas surveys can get a bit more qualitative in the kind of data they collect. So they can, for example, ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate something? Put the following things in order of preference from the most preferred to the least preferred in a list. Or give me a list of all of the social media tools that you use and tell me how often you use each one. So it's quite similar to a questionnaire, and as I said, there is some overlap between these different research tools. Now, I've listed a number of them there, so the question you may be thinking now is, how would I decide which one to use? Well, that's something I'll talk about on a later slide when you have to think about the purpose of your research, what you're going to do with the data you collect, how you'll analyse it, and how you'll use it. So let's move on to that, which will help you then to come back to this slide and work out which research tool might be most appropriate for you in the given situation, depending on what it is you're trying to find out. So on the previous slide, as I mentioned, you need to think about which survey tool or which research tool you would use. And I'll give you a quick overview of how surveys work, and it's the same sort of questions you'd need to ask yourself to decide which of the tools or approaches on the previous slide would be most appropriate in your given charity situation. The other thing you need to think about is how much it would cost to do if you did it with your own staff or if you outsourced it to a research company, how long it would take, and how accurate and valid are the results likely to be. So taking a survey as a case study example, you might need to think about the sorts of questions you'd ask yourself when you're choosing whether to do a survey or any of the other methods I showed you on the previous slide. So the same process applies. You need to ask yourself 3 questions in the 3 areas here. The first thing you need to ask yourself is, what are you trying to find out? Now that sounds quite an obvious thing to say, but you would be surprised at the number of people I've come across over the years who just kick off a survey or a questionnaire or start doing some market research with no clear understanding of what the end goal is and what they're actually trying to find out, whether they're trying to do deductive or inductive research, whether they'd be better off using primary or secondary data, or whether they'd be better off collecting qualitative or quantitative information. So although it sounds a silly question, find out and think about what are you trying to find out, and that to some extent will direct you to the most appropriate tools to collect that information. I'll give you an example. There was a health charity I was working with recently, and they decided to design a survey, and before they sent it they asked me to look over the questions and validate them and see if it was a sensible approach. And I noticed that the first thing they were asking everybody in the survey was what age bracket they were in, what income bracket, and what education level and what gender they were. And I said, well, that's terrific, you found out the age, the gender, the income and the education level, but what is the point of that data? Are you going to use that later on? Because, for example, if you send out 100 survey forms and you get back and you say, right, of those people, 60% were male and 40% were female, that doesn't actually tell you anything. The answer 60-40, the split 60-40, is because it's totally and solely dependent on the people that you sent the questionnaire to. If you'd sent it to a different 100 people, that 60-40 split would have been 70-30 or 80-20. So collecting demographic data seems important and seems valid and seems worthwhile, but first of all it's totally dependent on who you send the questionnaires or the survey to. That determines the gender, the income, the age and the education level, let us say, of your target audience, and in itself doesn't really tell you very much else. So why did you ask the questions in the first place? If, however, you relate gender or age to, for example, social media usage, you could say that in a female audience, the prevalent social media platform is Facebook, but among male respondents, the most prevalent social media platform was, let's say, Instagram. That tells you something. So if you want to communicate with men, you'll use Instagram. If you want to communicate with females, you'll use Facebook. And now you're starting to tie the demographic information into something meaningful elsewhere in the survey. So really I would encourage you to spend some time to think about what you're trying to find out before you decide on the most appropriate tool, before you decide on your survey sample size, and before you decide how much money you want to spend on the exercise. The next area you need to think about when you're choosing or using a survey tool is how you're going to execute and deliver the research into the audience. We've talked about this on the previous slide. You can choose to do it online, and I'll give you some tools and some advice on how you might do that. Basically, you're sending out your survey or your questionnaire, you're collecting information through the internet or through social media platforms or through your website. Offline is physical documentation. You're sending out a paper questionnaire, you're standing on the street with a clipboard asking questions, or you're standing outside an office or a store taking photographs or speaking to people or counting people as they go in or out. You could use a focus group, as I've discussed, or would you be better off doing one-to-one interviews with individuals? And then you can have open questions or hidden questions. So for example, if you wanted to find out about a particular type of charity, you could say, of the following cancer research charities, which ones would you give money to? And list 3 or 4 cancer research charities, and the respondent would say, yes, I'd give money to number 1 or number 2. Or you could say, which of these have you heard of, or which of these are you aware has done some research? So up front you're letting the people know which cancer research charities, in this case, you're asking about. Hidden research is you don't give them any prompts. You say, tell me, list all of the cancer research charities that you can think of. How many of these have you actually engaged with? How many of these have you given money to? Are you aware of the research that any of these cancer charities have done? So all of the information comes from the respondent's mind and the respondent's knowledge, with no prompts or no help from the questioner. And the final area is how you're going to collect and analyse the data. Are you going to use a simple tool like Excel and just report graphs and statistics and pie charts and scatter diagrams and line drawings? Or are you going to use some more sophisticated statistical analysis software such as SPSS or one of the other tools available in the statistics section of Excel? So how you will analyse the results depends what you're trying to find out and the sorts of tools or techniques that you use to collect the data. So these three areas that I've highlighted here on the main diagram, and with these question bubbles coming out of them, these are things you really need to think about before you go any much further in doing any particular analytical tool or technique. Because at the end of the day, you need to think, is what you're going to do as a result? What were you trying to find out? And once you've found out, how will it allow you to take positive, actionable activity to do something and to make a change or to develop something as a result of what you've discovered? Market research is often done, unfortunately, particularly amongst charities, for its own sake, and they publish tables or pages of reports and graphs and statistics, and they feel very good about themselves, but they don't actually use it to make any discernible change or progress in the activity of their charity in this situation. So please, please, please think about these areas before you get started. I hope I didn't put you off there with my strong words of caution on the last few slides. Let me now turn to some quick win approaches and some tools and techniques which you can pretty much use very quickly for not much cost and which get you some valid and useful market research information. And I've called this section Quick Win Approaches. There are two free digital market research tools which are used quite extensively by, for example, the students that I teach, by many of the charities that I engage with, and I've actually used them myself to undertake market research for my own business and for my own business purposes. And the first one is a type of primary research, which, if you remember, is research that you conduct or commission for your own purposes. You don't share with anybody else, and it's totally under your control and your design. There's a free online survey tool called SurveyMonkey. So if you go to the SurveyMonkey website, it very quickly allows you to design and set up a short questionnaire of, let's say, 15 or 20 questions. They can be multiple choice, they can be yes, no, they can be a scale of questions like rate the following on 1 to 10, where 1 is poor and 10 is excellent. So you can set up a quick survey, and then you can send it out by email to your chosen email list of respondents. So that's a free tool called SurveyMonkey. The basic package is free, but there is a limit on the number of questions you can have and the number of people that you can send them to. If you want a more sophisticated survey with more complex questions, or you want to send it to a greater number of people, then I have to say the charges are pretty minimal, but it does turn into a chargeable operation. But generally speaking, it's likely to be significantly cheaper than if you outsource the job to a market research company. The second research tool is something that covers the area of secondary research, and again it's one of the internet's best kept secrets, and I'm constantly amazed at how few people know about it. And it's a free service from Google called Google Alerts. So this is where you can get Google to go off and collect information from sources all across the internet. And if you go and search for the term Google Alerts, you'll get a screen like this. And what you can do is set up the keyword you're interested in. So for the example here, I've just chosen British Red Cross, just to give you an example. You can see how often you want the results fed back to you, and you can select once a day, once a week, or different frequencies. You can let Google select the most relevant resources from across the internet, and these will tend to be sites or sites providing this data that are very active and with a high number of users. So sites that change regularly and sites that have a high number of visitors. So for example, for the British Red Cross, if I set up to automatic, it would search the major news channels and see if people like BBC News or CNN or NBC or any of the world or national or international news networks are broadcasting any information, in this case about the British Red Cross. You can say, just get me websites in English, and you can say, I want all regions of the world, or I just want Europe, or I just want England, for example. And you can say, how many results do you want to receive? You can say only the most relevant, or you can just specify a number. So you could actually set this up to say, tell me the news from the UK about the British Red Cross once a day, but limit it to the 10 most relevant or the most important sources. And the final one is you put in your email address, and then automatically, without having to do anything else, Google will send you an email at the period you've specified. In this case, it would be once a day. With all the information is collected, the most relevant information about what's happening with the British Red Cross. So the keywords you can set up could be for your charity name, for other charities in the sector, for government ministers, for government policy, or literally any trend or topic or keyword or person's name or business name or charity name you can set up Google Alerts for. So that really is a tool I recommend that you get used to using, because it comes up with some fantastic information with almost no effort and certainly with no cost. So the way to think about Google Alerts is it's like trying to do lots of Google searches, but you don't have to do them yourself. Google will go and do them on your behalf. So rather than you every day searching for news on the British Red Cross, you tell Google to do it and it'll email you results automatically. So from my experience of working with charities and educational establishments and other livery companies, over the years I've found that these are the common areas, the most common areas that people decide to undertake research. The first one is to understand the satisfaction of different stakeholders in their business. And I'm going to talk about stakeholders in a later slide, but let's say for the sake of argument here it might be the beneficiaries. How happy are the beneficiaries of your charity with the services that you're delivering? Or how happy are the donors or sponsors of your charity with the value that they're getting from their engagement with you? The next one that's very common is the perception of the charity. And again, as I mentioned before, you can ask this unprompted or prompted, but you can ask people essentially what they think about your charitable organisation. You can ask the local government, you can ask central government, you can ask the local community, you can ask beneficiaries, and just get some opinions and perceptions of your charity. And I'll talk about a detailed approach to that in a later section of this briefing. You can ask for information at a deeper level, and so for example you can ask for how people evaluate the current performance of a particular service that your charity offers its beneficiaries and its clients. And I'll give you some more information on the next few slides about how you do that and the specific techniques and tools you can use to do it. The next example is desired attributes and performance. So rather than saying to somebody, one of your clients, what do you think about our charity in terms of value for money, ease of access, availability and quality, you can ask them what they would like to see. What are the things that are most important in a charity? And you can get them to tell you that they think the most important thing is availability, and then perceived cost or ease of access or hours of opening. So the first one is saying, these are what we do, tell us how well we do it. The last bullet I'm showing you here is what do you think we ought to do and how well are we doing that today? Are we delivering the sorts of value that you think we should be delivering? You remember in our earlier discussion of the definition of charity marketing, we discussed that it's all about the exchange of value. So the next kind of research that people often undertake is assessing the benefits or the value that's delivered to a given stakeholder group. So you could say to the beneficiaries or the clients of your charity, what value do you think and what benefits do you get from the support we give you? You could say to the donors or the sponsors of your charity, what value are we delivering you in return for your sponsorship or the money that you're donating? You can also ask for people's opinion about what new services they think the charity should develop. So you could explain to somebody, we deliver service A, B and C. How else could we bring services to the market, or what else could we be doing that would create value for you in your particular stakeholder group? And I'll give you an example of this new service development a bit later on in this series of briefings when I'll talk about a particular bereavement charity in Richmond, Surrey, that I worked with for some time. And we had big long discussions about how they should develop new services and what those new services should be. And I'll use that as a little mini case study later on when I get into the area of strategy. And finally, there's the whole area of brand recall, which is how memorable and how important is your charity's brand or your charity's services in the minds of the target audiences with whom you're trying to communicate. This is where, for example, if you were, say, a cancer research charity, without saying which one you were, you could go out and ask members of the public, tell me all of the cancer charities that you are aware of, or give me your opinion of which do you think is the most important, the most significant cancer research charity. So it's all about brand recall. Which brands do people know about? Which brands come to people's mind when asked? And is your brand, your charity, among those? The next section is about a particular process called ranking and rating, and I'm using a homeless shelter as a case study example here. Now, it might seem at first sight to be a little bit complex, but if you go through and perhaps replay this section once or twice, I think you'll pick up the idea and you'll see the amazing value you can get very quickly with the survey tools and the survey approaches that I'm going to describe to you here. So I'll introduce this table, which we use and build up in different steps as we go through this explanation. So the first thing to look at for this homeless charity is you've thought about the things that people might value or the things that people might find important in using the charity. So what sort of things would beneficiaries of this homeless charity find of value in its services? And I've given you some examples here. It might be the availability of places, a level of personalisation of the service, the location and coverage, how many areas across London, let's say, does it exist? Does it provide any extra medical services for people who are staying there? Does it give welfare advice and how to deal with social services or collect money or tax credits? Does it provide laundry services, and does it provide and have a cafeteria? So those are just a list of factors that you believed were important, and then later on I'm going to show you how we could get clients or beneficiaries of this homeless shelter to give their opinion to come up with a score. So the first thing you do is to get the beneficiaries to say how important each of those factors are. So you'd ask an individual client of this homeless shelter to say, if they had 100 points to allocate, how would they allocate it across those factors on the left? So you can see the results here. This individual said, well, the most important thing for them is the availability of places. The fact they can always get a bed there, they can always get a hot meal, they can always get shelter. And that's really significant, and they've given 40 out of 100 of the points available to that particular factor. The second most important thing they've said is the cafeteria service, the fact they can get a hot meal and drink and good food 24 hours a day if they happen to be a resident there. The third most important factor is the welfare advice that they get, followed by medical advice, and then there's three factors, which are personalised service, location, and the laundry service, which are not very important to these individuals. So that's the first thing. You get this survey form filled in by many of the target audience. So in this case, many clients of the homeless shelter. So I've shown you how you can use this table to get people's opinion on the importance of the different factors that this service delivers. But if you think about it, you can use it another way, and rather than coming up with a list of factors and asking people to rank them, you could actually ask the individuals, the beneficiaries, the clients of this organisation, what sort of things do you think are important for a homeless shelter? So the clients of homeless shelters say, well, to me, the most important thing might be availability, followed by medical services, followed by welfare. Somebody else would say, actually, no, the most important thing is hours of opening, followed by laundry services, followed by cafeteria. So if you just completed, not the ranking, but if you completed a collection of factors, what people thought were important, you're basically getting your client base to build up the factors in the left-hand column for you. So, for example, if you ask 200 of your beneficiaries or 200 of your clients of this homeless shelter what things they found important, what things they found the most valuable in a client, in a homeless shelter, then they would help you generate the list of factors on the left-hand side. Rather than, as I've just shown you, you've decided on the factors and getting them to rank them. So you can use this particular first two columns in two different ways: ranking the services that you provide, or getting your clients to tell you the services that you should be providing. Now, in order to get this done in a valid way, you'd probably need to ask at least 200 people, because that would give you a big enough sample size, and there are technical reasons why it's about 200 or more is a good starting point. But the more people you ask, the more representative the sample would be. But for most charitable situations, you need to get results from more than 200 people. So whether you're using it to get the ranking of the factors or to collect the factors themselves, you need to get this filled in by at least 200 clients in the case for homeless shelter. You could do the same thing for donors or for sponsors and get their opinion on different things, but you need to ask at least 200 of them. The next column of the table is filled in like this. If you remember, we've asked a particular client for the given factors, how important are they, and they've given us a ranking score in the second column from the left, where they've allocated the points, 40 being the most important, followed by 20, and then 15, 10 and some 5s. And then for each one of those you said, okay, now say how well we're doing it. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is pretty poor and 10 is very good, how well do you think we're able to meet your requirement for availability of places? You said it's your most important factor, you've given it 40. How well do we do it? And so, for example, for the welfare advice, which you've said is moderately important to you, how well do we deliver welfare advices at a homeless shelter? So again, for each of the factors, you ask them to give you a score. How well do we do it on a scale of 1 to 10? And that gives you the rating column, which is the third from the left. And then finally, to complete the exercise for this individual client results, you multiply the score for the ranking by the rating. So the first line is 40 times 6, which is 240. 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 8 is 40, and so on. So I've just multiplied the ranking score by the rating score to get a total score. And if you think about it, that right-hand column is actually going to have up to 1,000 points. So they're going to give it a score which, because the ranking could be 100 and the rating could be 10, the highest score you could possibly get is 1,000. But doing the sums, you can see here we've got 240 and 15 and 40 and 90 and so on. I've then added those up down to the bottom right hand corner, and you see that this individual, this one client who's completed this survey reform, has generated a score of 645 out of 1,000. Or putting it another way, they've given you an overall satisfaction score or a happiness score of 64.5%. And what you would need to do is to complete a form like this for 200 clients of this homeless shelter. So 200 people fill in a form here, and you get the score for each of them. You could add them up, divide them by the number of clients who've answered, and get an average, a mean average score, which is the total satisfaction score among your client base for the quality and importance of the services that you're delivering in your homeless shelters. And that's a very easy to follow, honestly it is, that's a very easy to follow process, and it's quite easy to administer. And you can do it for different target groups. You can do it for beneficiaries or clients. You can do it for investors, for donors, for volunteers, for sponsors. So almost all of the stakeholders in your company, in your charity, can fill in a form, and you can assess their satisfaction with the different factors that are relevant in their particular case. So whichever stakeholder group you're thinking about, whether it's clients or donors or sponsors or volunteers, just to reinforce, you need to do it for at least 200 respondents. Now I appreciate that some of the viewers of this briefing might have found the previous section a little bit convoluted and a little bit difficult to follow. This, on the other hand, is delightfully simple, and this is a technique called Net Promoter Score, and this is a way of measuring somebody's satisfaction with something with a single question. So for whatever it is you're measuring, so for example you might say, how happy are you with the value that the charity delivers? You could ask that to donors, and they have a choice of giving you a score between 0 and 10. So if they're very, very unhappy, they give you a score of 0 up to 10 if they're extremely happy. And what this method does is it categorises the people who give different scores into 3 categories. So people who rate your product or service or the quality of what it is you're delivering very highly are called promoters, and they're the people who give it a score of 9 or 10, and they're loyal, enthusiastic, they're likely to stay with you because they're really happy and delighted with whatever it is that you're doing for them. There are people in the middle who are called passives, and these are fairly unenthusiastic, middle of the road people, and they would have given you a score of 7 or 8. They're satisfied for now, but if somebody comes along with a better offer, there is a possibility and even a probability that they'll migrate away from you and go and engage with a different charity. And finally, there are the people who are really unhappy with the product or service or whatever it is you're surveying, and these are called detractors, and they will have scored between 0 and 6 in answer to this question. They're not happy, and the danger is that they start to voice this dissatisfaction on channels such as social media, which could possibly damage your brand. So to calculate the Net Promoter Score, as I said, it's very simple. You simply calculate the percentage of people who are promoters, the percentage of people who gave you a score of 9 or 10, and subtract from that the percentage of people who scored you between 0 and 6. And that simple arithmetic calculation gives you the Net Promoter Score. So it's extremely simple to do. You just ask one question to loads of people, you categorise them into promoters, passives and detractors, and from the percentage of promoters you subtract the percentage of detractors, and that is your Net Promoter Score. Very simple, easy to understand, and even easy to explain on a single slide. So I'd like to wrap up the last section of this briefing with a little bit of a discussion about stakeholders. We've talked about stakeholders in the last briefing and quite a lot in this one. Let me just explain on the next slide who stakeholders are and why it's important. And I've entitled this section, Who Cares Wins. On this slide, I'll give you a definition of stakeholders and show you who they might be in the situation of a charity. Stakeholders are groups who have an interest in the success of the charity. And you can see here from this diagram on the right, this is all the stakeholder groups that fulfill those categories. There's the beneficiaries of your charities, the clients. They obviously have an interest in the success and the quality of your charity. You then have the internal people in the charity who might be full-time and perhaps paid, or part-time and paid employees, and unpaid volunteers. So these are the service delivery people, paid and unpaid. You then have the community in which the charity operates, because they also will have an opinion about the worth and the worthwhile activities or otherwise of your charity. You have the people who provide financial support for your charity, donors who typically give money on a single basis or on a regular basis if they've got something like a direct debit or a standing order with you, and sponsors who are a particular type of fund givers who are usually more corporate or business oriented things who get something back. They might, for example, sponsor an event that you're doing. They might sponsor a section on your website, or they might provide an award or some support on a more regular and at a higher level. You've then got external audiences who look at your charity and take a view of the quality of the work that you're doing, and this is things like the media, the press, the TV, the radio, who report your charity as a news item. And then you've got the regulators from the Charity Commission or the Health Service, depending on the sort of charity that you operate and the sorts of services you provide. There might be government or national or international regulatory bodies that influence the sort of work that your particular charity does, working with children or with medicines or with animals or with environmental issues. So those are the stakeholders, and it's important that we take account of their wants and needs for several reasons. First of all, we can use that knowledge to communicate with them more effectively. We can use that knowledge to deliver products and services and value to each of them in ways that they find useful and reinforce positive attitudes towards your organisation. And it also helps us to decide where to direct our marketing activity to get the best results. In order to formalise that decision about which stakeholders are most important and which ones you should engage with more fully, there is this matrix called the Power Interest Matrix, which was invented by an academic, a marketing academic called Mendelau. And there are two axes. The vertical axis, which you can see there on the left, talks about influence or power of the stakeholder. So it's how influential and how powerful are they, low on the bottom up to high at the top. And on the horizontal axis is how interested and how much attention are they giving to your charity. So if you look at the top right box, here is a high power, high interest stakeholder group. Now this might be a government or a regulator. They're very interested in the performance of your charity, making sure you're acting in an ethical and responsible manner, and they've got the power to, for example, close you down or ask you to operate in a different way. So governments and regulatory bodies are typically both high power and high interest. They're very interested and they've got the power to make difference to you, whether they're happy or unhappy with you. On the bottom left corner, you've got low power, low interest. So for this stakeholder groups, they're not very influential. They can't actually influence and force you to change your behaviour, and actually they don't look at you very often. So the two blue ones are high power, low interest, and this is categories of stakeholders who you should meet their needs and keep them satisfied, or for low power, high interest, you should show consideration to them and keep them informed. And it's quite a useful exercise for your charity, whatever it happens to be, to take the stakeholder groups from the previous diagram, the circles around the circle I showed you on the previous slide, and populate this diagram with them. Where would you, for your charity, for example, put your community or donors or sponsors or the press or the media or suppliers? Where would they go on this diagram? And that certainly is a worthwhile exercise. So I encourage you in your own time to spend a few minutes or an hour or so going through the different stakeholder groups and putting them on this diagram. That brings me to the end of what I wanted to say today about market research. As I mentioned earlier, we're still going to stick with the situation step of the SOSTAC model for the next briefing, where I'm going to talk about three particular marketing planning frameworks which help you analyse the situation in which your charity operates at a global, at a sector, and at an individual charity level. And we'll talk about that in more detail in the next briefing. As I mentioned before, if you do have any questions or feedback or comments about this particular briefing, then please feel free to get in touch with me by email at the address shown here, which is peter.rees@gmail.com, and I'll answer any questions I receive as soon as I can. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with this quote, which came from an American academic, a historian from the University of Chicago called Daniel Boorstin. And what he said is, the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. And I hope in this lecture, this briefing on market research, I've given you some tools and techniques and approaches to make sure that you don't have the illusion of knowledge, you have knowledge itself. I'd just like to thank you for sitting through this briefing today. I hope you found it useful, informative, and something that you can use in a practical way in your own charitable organisation. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to joining you again soon for the next briefing in the series. Goodbye, good luck, and good marketing.